Hi all, I'm Professor Tina Good, and this video will be exploring the concept of American Transcendentalism, as well as its impact on the writings of Walt Whitman, and of course, Walt Whitman's impact on these ideals contained within American Transcendentalism. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to share my screen. And I have a PowerPoint here for you to look at as we go through some of the complexities of this thing we call American Transcendentalism. Okay, now listen, this is a very complex idea, as any philosophies are, okay? So I am not going to be able to contain or hit on all of those complexities, what each of the writers, what each of the thinkers of the time brought to the idea of transcendentalism, and this thing particularly known as American Transcendentalism. There are many books written on this, and the impact is different depending on how it is reflected in the literature of the time. But I do hope that this video will help us hit some key points to this thing we call American Transcendentalism. Also look at how we got to American Transcendentalism, that came out in the early 19th century. And then again, look at its impact on literature in general, especially American literature. Okay, so first, let's go ahead and start the slideshow. American Transcendentalism is also known as sort of our American Renaissance, right? The Renaissance, we've talked about Renaissance before. We've talked about the Harlem Renaissance, but generally the Renaissance, we generally think of Renaissance in the Western culture as, the Italian Renaissance or the English Renaissance, right? And so why is this period of transcendentalism known as the American Renaissance, right? Well, of course, I mean, the American Renaissance is going to come later than the European Renaissance because we organized as a country, as a nation later. So we're going to sort of our Renaissance is going to come later than, say, the British Renaissance or the Italian Renaissance. So Transcendentalism for America began in New England around early to mid 19th century, specifically in Massachusetts. And it is considered a uniquely American philosophy. Remember, we talked about the Harlem Renaissance, as that was also jazz was a uniquely American musical art form. And this philosophy is uniquely American. Does it only come out of America? No, no philosophy does. No philosophy only rises and exists within the time period that is created. It always draws on ideas from the past, reacts to ideas from the past, and then adapts to ideologies or new ideas that are happening at that time period in that particular culture. So this idea that they transform from ideas from the past is very, very much connected to transcendentalism, which focuses on interconnectedness, right? Whether it's from the past to the future, to the present, all of these ideas coming and flowing in, as well as the interconnectedness to the mind, body, spirit, the interconnectedness to, this the individual, the self, and the grander scope of the universe. Okay, so the transcendentalists include Ralph Waldo Emerson, who was essentially the father of American transcendentalism, Henry David Thoreau, you'll remember him on Walden Pond, Margaret Fuller, and of course the poet we're looking at today, Walt Whitman. So let's back up, right? And draw on that word Renaissance just for a second and think about what that meant. Well, in the European Renaissance, whether it's Italian or British, it meant the rebirth, right, of the classical period. So let's first look at this idea of rebirth, okay? Rebirth essentially means that there has been a life, and then that life has ended, right? Death, and then there is a rebirth, or somehow something has transformed through this act of living, dying, and then coming back, connected to what it was before, but somehow transformed. One of the metaphors that we often think about when thinking about this sort of thing is the butterfly, right? So we go to the caterpillar, right, which it starts out as. And again, this is metaphorical, but just think about it in this way. The caterpillar starts out, right? It's this caterpillar, and it eventually cocoons, goes into a deep sleep or, some kind of death, and then it comes out, right? This butterfly. Now, the caterpillar still resides within the butterfly, of course, right? But now it has transformed into something else. Okay, so be thinking about this idea of rebirth, particularly with the idea of transcendentalism, but also the classical period. Now, the Italian Renaissance started, around the 1400. It's often thought of, the sort of Petrarchan movement, and then the British Renaissance started, in the Shakespearean time, Queen Elizabeth's time, in the 1500s. So, classical period. It is a rebirth of the classical period, which means that, whatever went before the Renaissance, it seemed to sort of this classical period and the movements from the classical period, it suggested that it died, right? Whatever was going on in the classical period, which we would think of as like the ancient Greeks or the ancient Romans, and all of those philosophies and all of that art form and everything that came out of that, it went through a period of death, right? Which some people might think of as like that medieval period. Medievalists would, of course, disagree with that. I among them. And this is also that period where there is a lot of Christian imperialism coming in, right, into the Western world. So there seems to be sort of this death of these ideas that were coming out of the classical period, and then they somehow go through that Christian imperialism and everything else that was happening through the medieval period, and then it gets reborn again into this Renaissance, but it has transformed. That all of these things that happened between, right, the classical period and the Renaissance has had an impact on how it exists in this new time period. Okay, so let's look at the classical period. Now we'll talk about this more, but essentially just understand that in the classical period, there was no mind, body, spirit split. That in the classical period, the body, the mind, the spirituality, they all went into, what it was to be human. Okay. And there was no, like, the mind was over the body and the spirit was over the mind. None of that, right? It was all working together in this sort of interconnected way. And there was an acceptance of a divinity. Now it wasn't the Christian God that we think of later on in the or European Renaissance. They had a multifaceted God system, but there was an acceptance that there was a supernatural power, but that humans could access that, right? Or at least some could. If we look at Socrates and Plato and whatnot, Aristotle, women probably did not have a lot of access to that. But Sappho does allow women to have some access to the divine sort of inspiration, divine wisdom, but mostly it's a male-centered exploration. It is observation and philosophical study, right? That draws on logic, that draws on reasoning. Okay, it doesn't deny emotion, right? But that in order to access this, that we would use it through conversation, through communication with each other, and through this idea of deductive reasoning or inductive reasoning. And that this type of, study would lead us to enlightenment, right? Some sort of access to divine wisdom, even if just for a moment, right? We would access this enlightenment and connect then, or even be a part of, right, that divinity. Um, Enlightenment was also aided through challenging the body. Okay, so that through physical exercise, through sexual connection, that we could also achieve this enlightenment. It wasn't only something that was done through the mind, right? But it was also through the body. In fact, we know that the place of study, right, in ancient Greece was known as the gymnasium, right? And so there was a lot of wrestling and a lot of, a lot of sex, and it was through this sort of bodily exercise and extreme that we could also, with the mind, come to this enlightenment. Love, not necessarily romantic love, that doesn't come along until later, but love, this is sort of this divine love, could only exist in relationships that had the potential for equality. Okay, so love then, in the classical period was really sort of men to men or women to women, because men and women were not equal, right? In fact, there's often this sort of hierarchy, right? That there's men, and then there's women, and then there's animals, right? And so this sort of enlightenment, this sort of love could only exist between equals, right? But that being said, that humans therefore through proper teachings, through exercise, through reflection, through conversation, they could actually access divine love and even achieve, then, if you will, some sort of equality with the divine. Okay. Not in all senses, but through enlightenment, there would be this kind of conversation, this interconnectedness with the divine. Right. And so we see this mostly in the writings of Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Alexander the Great. So I use those, and of course there are many, many other writings, but I use this as an example so I can show the equality, right? So Socrates was Plato's teacher, right? And so Socrates, Plato was, Socrates' beloved, Socrates' student, and Socrates taught Plato. Plato was subordinate to Socrates as he was learning, as he was loving Socrates, right? But eventually, Plato can then come up to the same point where Socrates was. He could be equal to Socrates, right? And then we keep going through that motion, right? So then he takes on Aristotle as a student. Aristotle is subordinate. He is the beloved. He is the student. And they go through these interconnected relationships that would be problematic for us in the 21st century to think about, but it was not problematic then. And so there would be this sort of mind-body connection to help them to achieve this spiritual connection with the divine. And then Aristotle could move up, right, and be equal to Plato, et cetera, et cetera. Alexander is the student of Aristotle. You see the cycle, okay? See very much then that there could be equality with divine, but only with those groups that are equal with each other. Okay, so then the Renaissance in Europe borrows from this idea. Now, we have seen this shift with Christian imperialism that has come through, which very much changes the ideas of classical period, because it changes the idea of humans' relationship with God and what God is and who God is. But what we see here is that just like with the classical period, there is an acceptance of divinity, but it's sort of over here, right? And it's what we see with the European Renaissance is that we can access divinity but divinity actually resides within humans, right? So we have to access it through ourselves rather than trying to find that connection like in the classical period, right? We find it within ourselves. And how do we do that? We do that through creativity, right? Creativity is seen as a very divine activity, right? God is the one who gets to create. And so we tap into the divinity within us to create, to create art, to create music, to create love, right? To create all of those things that, come out of divine inspiration. Again, there's no mind, body, spirit split. These things are all working together to tap into that creative inspiration. Um, and we, rather than achieving enlightenment, right, we achieve inspiration. And this can be accessed through reason, through education, through emotion, and through sex. Now, it's important to understand, something about sex here because it connects later on, and that is that sex, or that idea of orgasm, at this time was believed that you had a little, what they call a little death, right? A little death at the moment of orgasm, and that through that death there could be this sort of connection with the divine, right? Because then you are reborn, right, after the orgasm, right? You have transformed in some way. The Renaissance also focuses on this idea of balance, right? So that you're balancing all of these, what they call the humors, or philosophy or love. Nothing ever gets a little bit too crazy, because imbalance would lead to social disease, would lead to physical disease, right? And of course, that was going on a lot in the Renaissance, whether you're looking at Italian or British Renaissance, right? Religious wars are happening, political wars are happening. And so it is looked at like that's an imbalance, right? So that we need to keep things in balance in order to achieve this inspiration, right? That the world will intrude on our ability to create if it is not in balance. Now, the literature doesn't really bear this out so much, and we see that literature is actually focusing on the imbalance, on the extreme. But the philosophy is there. Is this idea that balance must be achieved. So then later on, again, religious wars, all of this stuff happens. And now we begin to go like, you know what? We need to pull away from this. And there is this idea that, okay, what separates humans from animals, right? Because there is this need to bring control. That balanced idea wasn't quite working in the Renaissance, as we've just discussed. And all of this turmoil and sort of religious inspired torture and upheaval. The philosophers at the time, such as Descartes, come in and say, we have to stop this, and we have to focus more on our ability to think. The thing that separates us from animals, they suggested, is our ability to reason, right? And so the very famous line, "I think, therefore I am," is what comes out of that. It is our mind that gives us our essence. It is our mind that gives us our existence, right? And so now is when we really begin to see that mind, body, spirit split, which, very much still exists today. Maybe not quite as harshly as it was then, but we saw that this privileging of the mind. Now, this was also, just like with the Greeks, this was also gendered, right? And so the mind was very much associated with male perspective, right? The body very much with the female, right? Females were, emotional, and they needed to be controlled by the reasonable male. And, while they did not necessarily deny the existence of spirituality, they did not necessarily deny the existence of some sort of supreme being, it was irrelevant, right? That could not be known. So let's look at what we can know, right? And so that you would achieve universal truth, if you will, through not unlike the classical period, this idea of reason and logic. We take that body part out of it, but that is not unlike the classical period, where we're focusing on reason and logic to achieve some sort of universal truth. Okay. This kind of thought, the Enlightenment thought, as you all know, heavily influenced the documents drafted for America by our founding fathers. Now, in reaction, then, we're still in Europe now, and in reaction to that idea of enlightenment, we get this movement called Romanticism. Why did that happen? Well, it wasn't working, right? The idea of focusing everything on reason wasn't working. There was the American Revolution, there was the French Revolution. Things were getting out of control. This idea of severe logic and wit, if you will, was not doing what it was promised to do, and that is to sort of, bring order to things, right? And so the Romantic movement began to say, listen, it is not necessarily reason that separates us from the animals, but it is in fact our emotions. It is in fact our ability to love, to hate, to fear, right? There's still this mind-body spirit split, but the body takes a little bit more privilege now. And the idea is that we access the divine, right, through experiencing the sublime, this awesomeness, right, through experiencing nature in some sort of really awesome way. So it's through extreme emotion rather than reason that we become to be able to know ourselves and to know the divine and to come to some sort of, creative inspiration, but also a different way of understanding enlightenment. So you might want to refer to my video earlier on Romanticism to get a better idea of the tenets of Romanticism. But Transcendentalism then exists within that idea of Romanticism. Okay, it translates into America, but let's look at it, sort of break it down just a little bit. When we think about transcend, what does it mean? Transcendentalism is huge, right? But transcend means to go beyond a limit, like you transcend something. We transcended it. We transcended a boundary, right? And so for transcendentalism, we are at its core suggesting that we somehow move beyond everyday human experience and the physical world, right? We get away from that rationalism of enlightenment, this idea of through observation, right? We can come to some sort of knowledge and understanding of universal truths, right? And go like, no, we have to go beyond that, right? To understand or to have access to a supreme being, maybe, or a universe, or a self, right? It all depends on who you're reading and what that perspective is on the nature of a supreme being or access to the universe. But transcendentalism is essentially, therefore, optimistic. Because if you're able to transcend all these boundaries, right, if your possibilities are limitless, right? There's nothing stopping you, so you can just transcend them. You got to figure out how to do that, right? But it is something that allows for much more possibility, right? And also within transcendentalism, that humans are essentially good, right? That there's goodness within us. It doesn't mean that they don't do evil, and we know that they did, right? They accepted that. This was a time of slavery, and transcendentalists were very much against slavery, so we knew that they had capacity for evil, but that within them was this essential good, and that what it was upon us to do is to tap in to that essential goodness in order to, sort of override those other tendencies. There's a huge focus on the soul, and the soul was considered to be what was immortal, right? So whether or not there was a supreme being, that depends on who you're reading, right? But this idea of immortality, again, that's this idea of divine immortality, rests in the soul. And that all souls are connected, right? So you have all of our souls being connected. The soul is divine. So there's this massive sort of divinity of souls, right? Emerson calls it the oversoul. But it's this idea that it's the interconnectedness is where we find the divinity, right? And that is either like our connection to a God, right? Or it's where the divine exists, right? Within that interconnection of the souls. So again, now we're going back to the Renaissance idea, to the classical period idea, where there is no mind-body split, right? Transcendentalism insists on interconnectedness, right? And so to separate them out would be, against their philosophy, and that it's through the interconnectedness of these things, right, that we begin to experience some kind of human reality or human truth. One of those big boundaries that gets sort of transcended in American transcendentalism is this idea of death, right? That there's life and then there's death. And for transcendentalists, like death was not an ending, right? The death was just like with the rebirth situation, death was just a transformation, right? So again, we see, a lot of hopefulness there, a lot of optimism there, because it's not an ending, right? It's a transformation. It's a rebirth into something else, right? Perhaps, again, think of the butterfly. And to access this sort of divine wisdom or universal truth or even awareness of the self, right? All those things would have been considered, these great mysteries that needed to be discovered. One way to do it was through nature, right? And nature was seen to have embodied sort of the divine in an unchecked way. And that if you could just ponder a mountain or a leaf or a flower or air, that somehow this would lead us to an understanding of divinity, of the interconnectedness, right? And that in order to do this, that we would rely on our intuition, right? This idea of that soul again, but there's something within us that will lead us there, right? Not reason, not deductive reasoning, not that those things were not good. They're not saying that that's not good. They did not deny the importance of science. But that was more of a framework, if you will, to help, yes, meet the everyday needs of the world, right? But it was not what got you to these great moments of divine wisdom, right? Of universal truth, of knowledge of the self. That came through exploration of our intuition, what was inside of us. Access to his divine wisdom came through also not only through nature, but it also came through art, right? Through poetry, through visual arts, through painting, and also sexual connection, right? Going back to this idea of the Renaissance, that somehow through this interconnectivity, that sex allowed for humans to experience in a physical way, that this could also lead us to some sort of, divine wisdom, some kind of creative inspiration. Okay. And so for American transcendentalism, the thing that makes transcendentalism uniquely American is that not that it focuses away from reason, which of course it does, but it really focuses on those American ideals of the individual, of resistance, and of activism, right? I mean, if you think about it, if they would have been focused on reason, there would never have been an American Revolution, right? Because it was like we would never win. So why would we do that, right? Americans were not supposed to win that war. And yet they focused on individualism. They drew from the heroic ideas of Romanticism and focused on this idea of resistance and activism, that through these ideals that we achieve awareness of the self, awareness of divine that had to be enacted in some way for the social good, right? Not just the individual good, but the social good, right? And so for American transcendentalists, the individual, right, is the microcosm of the interconnectedness of the universe, right? So individuals, the soul, all of everything within us is connected, and that is a microcosm of our connection with the universe and the universe itself, connecting with all of the spirit, the divine, all of the souls, all of the boundaries being erased so that we could transcend them. So how does this get reflected in Walt Whitman? Walt Whitman is probably, considered one of the most influential American poets to this day. Um, and not only does he reference nature, right, leaves of grass, right, but also he references the need for expression. Okay, so again, that idea of resistance, that idea of activism, that has to come out through expression. It's not enough just to have these, sort of philosophical individual ideas, right? That has to be enacted towards the social good, right? The good of others. So if we look at his major work called Leaves of Grass, right, we see this kind of metaphorically playing out. So we have leaves, right? We have leaves, which are, leaves from trees, the idea of nature. They go through the death and they are transformed and all of those wonderful things that happen to leaves, right? But leaves were also known at the time, they were also known as pages. So the leaves of a book or the pages of a book, right? And so we see this idea of nature, but also this need for expression, right? Through writing, in his case, through poetry. Grass, again, this idea of the individual spear of grass, but then the interconnectedness of grass, right? If you ever like try to pull up grass, right, you'll see that all the grass comes out in clumps, right? You can't, not just one little, but they are connected, right? This interconnectedness, right, through nature, through the divine, right? So the individual grass, but then its connectedness to all of the other grass, right? Leaves of grass. So it's in the play that we're reading, I and You, it talks about leaves of grass being a collage, right? Because leaves of grass, it doesn't begin and end, right? Because he just keeps transforming it throughout his life. He works on this same work throughout his life, and he just keeps transforming it over and over and over again, right? Exhibiting not only, the interconnectedness of his experiences, but the interconnectedness of time, right? And think of it a little bit like this, guys, when we think about a collage. Um, you probably don't know a lot about quilting, but if we look at quilts, a lot of times, you have these individual squares that all contain their own sort of artwork, right? And then they are stitched together to create a large, so there's this little artworks, and then there's the larger artwork that is created by all of the individuals, right? So that's kind of that interconnectedness that we're looking at, right? You have the individual, very important, but then it weaves together, right, to create this interconnectedness of a larger piece, of a larger art form, of a larger world. Okay? And then we look specifically at Song of Myself. I want to break this down a little bit. Song of Myself, of course, is the most famous poem within Leaves of Grass. But let's think about song. And again, we're gonna refer back a little bit, right? So in medieval times, song or even in Greek times, song was seen as, a celebration, right? If there was a heroic act, you had a song about it, right? You wrote a song about it. And why did you have songs? Well, because at the time, a lot of, especially in medieval times, was really an oral culture. There wasn't a lot of, writing that happened. And even back in the Greek times, where there was more writing, not everybody could read, right? And so you had these songs because they had these rhythms and these rhymes and these, ways of remembering so that those heroic moments or those sad moments or whatever it was that was important to be remembered got passed down generation to generation. And that, so whatever those songs were about had its own sort of immortality, right? It continued to live as long as those songs were sung, right? And so what is he looking at? He's doing a song of my and then self. Think of that self, not just myself, but self, right? What is the self? The celebration of the self, right? And that this has to be passed on, right? So that there is this idea of interconnectedness, rather than death, that there's this immortality through expression of the self, right? It is not limited to the self only. Again, it is connected to the universe and all things, but it does also, like if we were to read all of it, we would see, right, that there is sort of this physical reality, right? There's this realism that sort of comes in, and we look at the physical world and begin to observe it, but that is not enough, right? That we have to look at the spiritual aspects of it. How did this come to be? Again, nature is a way to access this because it is an unchecked, for Walt Whitman, an unchecked expression of original energy, right? And this is before, Einstein and whatnot, right? Is this idea that he's not denying a God per se, but that there was this energy that existed. And that is what, through that, all of this interconnectedness, right? And that if we think about the way energy is, right, is this energy never goes away, right? It transforms, right? That no matter what, energy exists. Maybe it exists in a different way than it did at one time, but it never leaves the universe, right? And so this begins to be something that they really explore, right? Again, this idea of transformation, of transcendence. Sexuality, very much a part of Whitman's poetry, is a celebration of the body and desire. There is this emphasis that there's a reason that we have desire, right? And it is through exploration of that desire, that interconnectedness of bodies, right? And again, that sort of Renaissance idea of the divinity of orgasm, right? Comes some sort of awareness, right? That's not a religious awareness per se, but more of an inspirational awareness. It advocates more of a direct connection with each other and with the divine, rather than affirming any sort of religious doctrine, right? Doctrine is going to be something that they don't. This is why transcendentalism is hard to define, because as soon as you define it, then they're going to want to transcend it, right? But what it does lead us to is this idea of just eternal hope, right? That yes, there are bad things. Yes, there are hard things that we have to go through, right? But that we will transcend that, and that somehow that we will have a transformation like the butterfly, right? And be more beautiful and more hopeful and more able to express and connect, right, with each other and with the divine. Okay, so I hope that you found this video useful. It is very hard to sort of grasp transcendentalism, but you can see how we began to break away those boundaries of mind, body, spirit, and unite them and explore for universal truth this idea of the interconnectedness. Now, I just want to let you know before I sign off, this idea of universal truth by the 20th century begins to go away, right? And that this idea of the universal truth does not represent all humans, that it's a sort of white, privileged way of looking through this idea, just like with the Greeks, right? Only certain people could do this. So it does begin to go away by the time we start thinking about different experiences by different people. So maybe there's not this universal truth for everyone, but it is still in the 19th century, this sort of core way of accessing philosophy, of accessing literature, and accessing the self. Okay, so we'll talk about this more in the stuff we're reading ahead, but I hope that you have found this useful, and I'll see you in my next video.